cold and lay high.
300 Blackout is a very cool, very versatile cartridge, but it's definitely not going to replace 5.56 as your primary rifle cartridge. There are still plenty of reasons to add 300 Blackout to your inventory, and we're going to talk about what it can do and what it can't do in this video. Some of this stuff is pretty basic, but we have to get through it because we're going to be talking more about 300 Blackout soon. So what is 300 Blackout? I'm kidding. If you want the history and the case measurements, you can get that stuff off of Wikipedia. But in brief, it's easy to compare 300 Blackout to 7.62 by 39. The bullet weights and velocities are very similar. 123 grain supersonic ammunition is extremely common for 7.62 by 39, and that's one of the loads you can get for 300 Blackout. Subsonic loads are also available for both calibers. However, the more common bulk or plinking load for 300 Blackout is going to be in the middle, right around 150 grains. Probably because it's using a very commonly available 308 projectile. 300 Blackout can be fired out of an AR platform with just a barrel replacement. None of the other parts have to be swapped out. It's almost never a good idea to convert an existing AR to 300 Blackout, but it does mean that building a 300 Blackout AR is very easy. You take advantage of a huge amount of the aftermarket, and most of the parts are completely standard. 300 Blackout is a great candidate for a short-barreled AR. 5.56 achieves its terminal effect via fragmentation and tumbling, both of which are extremely dependent on velocity. Shorter barrels cost you a lot of velocity. 55 grain 5.56 ammunition shot out of a 10.5-inch barrel drops below the threshold for effective fragmentation at about 45 yards. Generally speaking, heavier bullets do better at slower speed than lighter ones. This gives 300 Blackout two big benefits over 5.56. One is suppression. By decoupling the effectiveness of 300 Blackout from velocity, we're also able to go much shorter with our barrel length. It's commonly accepted that approximately 9 inches is all you need to get a full powder burn from 300 Blackout. 5.56 continues to get significant velocity gains all the way up to an 18-inch barrel. 300 Blackout is much more suited to short barrels and especially to suppression. In essence, 300 Blackout is two separate cartridges. The difference between supersonic and subsonic loads in performance and potential application is more significant than almost any other cartridge out there. We can use 9mm and 5.56 as examples. 115 grain supersonic 9mm and 147 grain subsonic 9mm both do the same thing. The subs are a little nicer if you're shooting suppressed, and heavier bullets tend to penetrate better at low velocity when fired from short barrels, but realistically, we're just splitting hairs. It's the same story with 5.56. The lighter, faster bullets will have better fragmentation and wounding effect at shorter range, but the heavy 77 grainers will retain more energy at long range and stay stable out to longer distances. Does it matter? Barely. With 300 Blackout, it's like we have two different cartridges. The difference between a light for caliber 110 grain load and a heavy for caliber 220 grain load is extreme. The heavy subsonics are twice the weight and potentially over 1,000 feet per second slower. So with 300 Blackout Supers, we're basically shooting 7.62 by 39, and with subs, we're basically shooting a more aerodynamic 45 ACP. That's a very rough comparison, but it illustrates the kind of versatility you can get out of the cartridge. You should not expect to get that kind of versatility out of a single gun and optic setup, though. If you set up your rifle and your optic with one of these two extremes and then switch to the other, you'll have a wildly different point of impact and a totally different trajectory. Alright, this target is sort of heavily worn in, so forgive the clutter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 supersonic impacts at 100 yards. Down here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subsonic at 100 yards. That's a piece of shrapnel from a rock or a steel target or something, I don't know what. Significant. The recoil impulse will be totally different, so if you tune your gun to run supersonic ammo smoothly, it might not even cycle with subs. If you tune it for subs, it'll run itself ragged on supers.
Okay, I wasn't expecting that.
Me either. But yeah, it changes. Ooh, I got gassed out a little bit there.
I got brassed out.
First was subs?
No, the subs were definitely the second ones.
The idea that you can turn a fighting rifle into a silent submachine gun just by changing magazines is kind of a video game idea. Mostly. We'll come back to this. The takeaway for now should be that 300 Blackout can do a bunch of different things, but it can't do them all at the same time. So 300 Blackout, what is it actually good for? AK fans will point out that since 300 Blackout is basically just 7.62 by 39, why don't you use a short AK or a short AR chambered in 7.62 by 39? Well, we don't shoot AKs because they have terrible ergonomics and they're impossible to modernize. And we don't shoot 7.62 by 39 out of the AR platform because the magazines for it tend to kind of suck, and since the cartridges have a larger diameter, the bolt is thinner and prone to cracking. One potential application for 300 Blackout that will at least pay lip service to is hunting. Hunting laws vary so much from state to state that it's almost not worth talking about. If you know what your local hunting laws are, then you know if you need 300 Blackout or not. In some states, you can't hunt certain game with a 5.56 AR, but a 300 Blackout AR would be totally fine. But then again, there are states that restrict hunting to straight wall cartridges, and there are areas like the one I live in where you can only hunt with shotguns. So if you need to hunt deer with a weird caliber like 300 Hammer or 25-45 Sharps, you're going to have to figure that out on your own. As far as the tactical or defensive application of 300 Blackout goes, we can take it in two directions. One is maximum suppression. Subsonic 300 Blackout shot through the right suppressor has the potential to be very quiet. On top of just being awesome to shoot, that can have some tactical application, whether it be home defense or something clandestine. If being extremely quiet is not your objective, 300 Blackout can also be used to mitigate the loss of terminal effect from a short-barreled platform. A super short 300 Blackout PDW can be very light and handy while still retaining reasonable terminal effectiveness and possibly being a little bit more barrier blind than a 5.56 out of the same platform. Let's talk about three potential 300 Blackout builds here, kind of like Goldilocks and the three SBRs. On one side of the equation, we're going for maximum suppression. For this build, we go with a super short barrel, probably about 5 inches, and we use a much longer suppressor because we want it to be very quiet. We have no expectation of ever using supersonic ammunition in this gun. It's subsonic only, whether that's because you're a special forces operator who's up to some evil deeds, or because you want to use it in a self-defense situation where you're probably not going to have ear protection on. On the other side of the spectrum, we're prioritizing short-barreled performance, and we're not expecting to use it with subsonic ammo ever. For this one, let's say we use a 10.5-inch barrel with maybe a short suppressor as an option. Supersonic ammunition only, probably as light for caliber as we can get. There are a couple of potential applications for this, whether as a brush gun or a hiking gun or something for extreme CQB. For example, use in a vehicle or as a bag gun. Whether you want that heavier 30 caliber bullet for pushing through dense brush or auto glass, it's not really important. The Goldilocks option in the middle is for those with commitment issues. Just for the sake of argument, let's say this one has an intermediate barrel length like 7.5 or 8.5. If we're trying to take full advantage of the versatility of 300 Blackout, this one would be shot mostly suppressed, although you could remove the can to make it more compact for putting in a bag or transporting it. The trick here is to have a starter magazine of subsonic ammunition and all subsequent magazines loaded with supersonics. Use 0 to the supersonic ammunition with the suppressor attached, with the understanding that if you have to deploy it rapidly from a bag or from the inside of a vehicle, a slight point of impact shift is not going to be the biggest thing on your mind. If you're using this in a more proactive context, you might find a use for that first magazine of subsonics before perhaps you are completely compromised and need to go loud anyway. Any shots taken with the subsonic ammunition is probably going to be at close range and in a bit of a hurry, so again, a slight point of impact shift, not an important consideration. Subsonic ammunition probably isn't going to do you a lot of good in a firefight. When it comes to optic selection for a 300 Blackout, the choice is going to depend on what you're trying to use the build for, more than the build itself. Either a red dot or an LPVO or a red dot with a magnifier would all be acceptable here as long as you know what you're getting yourself into. The important thing to keep in mind is that if you plan to shoot past 75 to 100 or so yards with subsonic ammunition, you're going to want some way to compensate for the bullet drop, which is extreme. A heavy bullet that leaves the barrel at a subsonic velocity should have a predictable flight path and should make it reasonably predictable out past 100 yards. If you're shooting with a red dot, that'll be well beyond your maximum point-blank range. If you're shooting with an LPVO or some kind of scope, you can probably either dial for that extreme amount of drop or compensate for it with a reticle.
Okay, subs on the first dot.
I'm not saying it's the best choice for long-range shooting. I'm just saying if you're going to give it a go, you're going to want some way to compensate for the bullet drop other than holding your red dot 5 feet above the target. I'll also briefly mention tuning a 300 Blackout gun. It's a delicate balancing act between running suppressed and unsuppressed with supersonic or with subsonic ammunition. That is 4 very distinct behaviors, and you can't tune for all of them. Okay, we can probably ignore the possibility of shooting subs without a can, because that would be a waste of expensive subsonic ammunition, but that's still 3 possible configurations. If you ever think your 300 Blackout gun is going to shoot subs, accept that it'll run a little bit hard with supers. So don't throw a super heavy buffer in it and restrict the gas to make it pillowy soft with supers and a suppressor. Then drop a mag of subs in there and wonder why it won't feed or lock back reliably. I'll talk about the specifics of my 300 Black PDW build later, but it is not overly tuned for any extreme of ammunition. Let's talk about some of the downsides of 300 Blackout. One of them is ammo cost. 300 Blackout is quite a lot more expensive than 5.56. You can get fairly affordable 300 Blackout steel case supersonic ammunition for plinking, but all the rest of it is very expensive. A lot of it is either focused on hunting or suppression, or sometimes both, so they tend to be sort of bespoke loads when you're buying them in the store. The subsonic loads in particular can be insanely expensive, and as of right now, they're almost unavailable even buying online. $50. But keep in mind one important thing. You don't have to train with 300 Blackout. You train with the platform, which is a normal AR-15. You need to shoot enough 300 Blackout to configure your optics and to understand the capabilities of your cartridge, as well as to make sure your gun is reliable. But you don't need to shoot a ton of ammunition every month to stay copacetic on what is, at the end of the day, a short AR with a little extra recoil. Yes, the ammo is expensive, so just buy less of it and keep your other AR handy. Another thing to keep in mind is that 300 Blackout ammunition is way heavier than 5.56 ammunition. If you trade out a full combat load of 5.56 ammo for 300 Blackout, you're going to add a couple of pounds to your overall kit weight. If your objective to begin with was to shave some weight by replacing a medium-barreled AR with a short-barreled 300 Blackout, you're going to gain some of that weight back immediately just because of the ammunition. Alright, that's basically all we got time for right now. Hopefully that made sense and wasn't totally pointless, but we have to set the scene for some upcoming 300 Blackout bullshit. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, something, subscribe star, video description. I'll see you next time.